I'm Marvin Pinkert, Executive Director of the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and I want to welcome you all to tonight's program, Fighting Back Against Hate. I want to begin by thanking the folks at the Baltimore Office of Promotion in the Arts who are sponsoring Free Fall once again. They're an organization that helps Baltimore be a resilient city, and so I welcome their participation. Tonight's program is a part of a year-long series of events related to becoming upstanders, turning our historic memories into social action. Just in case you were wondering why they were marked with an up arrow in our program guide. Other upcoming programs on this theme include our special partner series with Chizuk Emuno on Jews of color, Jewish institutions, and Jewish community in the age of Black Lives Matter. The series kicks off this Sunday at 4 p.m. with a conversation on identity and community between author Gina Green and psychologist Dr. Harriet Wims on identity and diversity in the Jewish community. Also in the Upstander theme is a program with Sally Grant next Wednesday. Miss Grant is a great-granddaughter of Sadie Crockett, and she'll be sharing the inside scoop on her ancestor, a prominent Baltimore suffragist who's featured in a current special exhibit at JMM that's up through Election Day. So I encourage you to go vote. And while you're out, plan to stop by JMM. Just remember to make a reservation before you stop by. Tonight, we turn our attention to a bitter memory of the recent past, a memory that is truly a point of inflection. How do I know this? Well, consider for a moment what would have happened if you'd Googled the word Charlottesville in 2016. The first page of links would likely have dealt with the athletic exploits of the University of Virginia or the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. If you searched hard enough, you might even find a reference to Uriah P. Levy, the Civil War naval commander who began the restoration of Monticello. Google Charlottesville today, and the dark cloud of the events of August 2017 dominate the page. It's become a code word like Columbine or Jonestown for a peculiar type of American madness and menace. It takes exceptional insight to draw a light of hope out of all of this darkness, and that's what tonight's guests have done. A few years ago, a woman came into my office seeking advice on how to pursue a museum career. I have no idea whether the advice I gave her was good or bad, but I do know that someone as talented as Alexandra Horowitz scarcely needed my counsel. She was a former senior producer at CNN International. She spent nearly 10 years covering business and economics for CNN and its various networks from bureaus in New York, Washington, London, and Hong Kong. She now works independently as a writer, director, and producer of documentary shorts for nonprofits. Just before COVID, she produced the Ida Rear immigrant trunk video for JMM. And she's also produced films for the Capitol Jewish Museum in DC, the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society, and Washington's DC's Theater Lab. She's an officer of the Capitol Jewish Museum and a member of the Council of American Jewish Museums. Please welcome Alexandra Horowitz.
Thank you, Marvin. And your advice was great. And I so appreciated your time back then. And I appreciate your having me tonight. It's really wonderful to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you. On August 12, 2017, I was working out in a hotel gym in Western Massachusetts. As I rode the elliptical, I watched TV and saw hundreds of marchers in Charlottesville, carrying torches and chanting, "Jews will not replace us." I was stunned. Never in my half century of life as an American Jew had I encountered the kind of hatred now on screen. The brazen demonstration bore no resemblance to my day-to-day experience. Jews of Charlottesville also felt this disconnect, I learned later. White supremacy was not something that normally permeated their daily lives. That this violence came literally to the doorstep of their synagogue truly surprised them. But as they reached out into the broader Charlottesville community to build bonds and to push back against the hatred, they realized that their African-American neighbors were not shocked at all by the violence. That was a significant realization, and it changed them. What I've tried to capture in this film is not only how the Jews struggled to confront white supremacy, but also how that struggle transformed their understanding, both of themselves and their city. Reawakening is based on the Charlottesville Jewish Oral History Project, a project conducted by Dr. Phyllis Leffler, Professor Emerita of History at the University of Virginia. It was made possible by a grant from the Southern Jewish Historical Society. It's my pleasure now to welcome to the program Rabbi Tom Goodhertz, who is the Senior Rabbi of Congregation Beth Israel, which is Charlottesville's only synagogue. Welcome, Rabbi Tom. I'd like to start by asking you, August 2017, it's only 3 years ago. It seems like a lifetime ago in some ways. Certainly in our awareness of white supremacy, we are in a very different place from where we were at that time. Can you take us back to that moment and tell us more about the immediate impact on your congregation and their actions in the aftermath of the rallies?
Yes. So first, thank you, Alex, for all the work that you've done in terms of making this film and helping to tell the story, and also to Marvin and the Jewish Museum of Maryland for taking the time to look at it. You know, if I go back to that summer in August of 2017, you know, the background here was, of course, a discussion that had already been happening in our town about these two Confederate monuments, one a statue of Robert E. Lee and one of Stonewall Jackson, that are in public parks, which, by the way, are only 1 block away from the synagogue in either direction. And after the city council decided to take down those, and there were a lot of conversations, you know, in the congregation, in the town, should we take them down? Do they belong here? Should we contextualize them? That was the conversation that we were having. Until, of course, we started to get word that people began to come here, were planning to come here to protest that issue. And actually, there had been a rally of the Ku Klux Klan about a month before the Unite the Right rally. A few people, you know, with the costumes and everything, had come from a small branch in North Carolina. They were completely overwhelmed by counter-protesters. But I do remember that at that moment, when we looked at that crowd, of all the signs that they were carrying, I would say about half of the signs were anti-Semitic. And we're scratching our heads like, what? You know, this is about the monuments. What does this have to do with anti-Semitism? And then the Unite the Right, the rally that was planned for August, we started to get information about that. And I guess I want to ask Laura to maybe share the screen to see the poster that they put out for this rally, which was ostensibly about protesting the monuments. I mean, you can't see necessarily the whole thing, but you just take one look at that screen. There you go. And, you know, before you come any closer, I mean, this is clearly, you know, you almost have to look, you almost have to blink to think, you know, this is a Nazi poster, you know, all the imagery, all the signs, the graphics, clearly Nazi iconography. And we're sort of struggling to get on top of this, you know, like, what is the connection here? What is, how is anti-Semitism playing a role in this discussion about the monuments? And of course, we spent a lot of time on the dark web and looking at some of those websites that, you know, I never want to have to go to again. So there was a kind of a sense of dread, I would say, and conversations in our congregation about how to react. You know, some people say just ignore them and they'll go away. Others say, no, we need to get out there and resist them. We really didn't know what was going to happen. And even in the week before, it was back and forth about whether or not the rally would be allowed to take place, whether it would take place where it was supposed to. A lot of misunderstanding. You know, at the same time, our community and myself and Rabbi Rachel were very connected with the Charlottesville Clergy Collective, which many of the pictures that you saw in that film, many of those events are events that our Clergy Collective has done together. And this was a group that organized itself actually after the shootings in Charleston, South Carolina, when an African-American pastor woke up one day and said, look, if this happened here in Charlottesville, who would I call? Who would I call? We realized that as clergy and as religious congregations, we really didn't know each other. So we began meeting way before the events of August 2017, every month to get to know one another. We tried to broaden our coalition, specifically focused on issues of racial justice, so that when these events came to town, we already had a network of people, of allies, of people who were working together with the larger congregations to try and make a public resistance to this. But I could tell you that nothing quite prepared me for seeing in the streets, the pictures that you just saw, that you captured so well in that film. It was as if a newsreel, a black and white newsreel from the 1930s had come alive in color. And those signs and those symbols, some of which we, couldn't quite figure out, but they're clearly Nazi flavored. And to see the people behind them shouting those slogans, loudly and proudly, that was really a shock. It was really, really a wake-up call to have them in your streets, to hear them while we decided in our congregation that we were not going to happen to be Shabbat. We decided to do our Shabbat morning service right here in the synagogue at the epicenter. We did decide to do it an hour early so that we could be done by 11 o'clock, and those people who wanted to be part of what was going on the streets and the resistance could go, and also some of our other members who were a little less secure could get home and out of town. But to be in the sanctuary, to be praying and to hear the shouts outside, like the ones that you saw in your film, was truly a shock. I mean, I don't know any other way to say it. To see that hate kind of walking around in front of you really, set us back. And not just us, but I think the entire, certainly the Jewish community, but also I think, I guess I wanted to ask you, what was it that you thought you were going to find? Why were you so interested in this story? What did you find what did you want to see about, what did you want to learn about this?
So I think it was a couple of things. One is exactly what you're talking about. I mean, I remember having no connection to Charlottesville myself. I remember watching this on TV, and it was such a shock. And also, I felt confused too, because the Confederate monument story, it had been, I thought, a Southern story, a story of, how communities were coping with this part of their history that had to do with the Civil War, and honoring, on the one hand, potential, people considered by some to be war heroes, and people considered by others, obviously not to be. And so it really seemed local. And to have the anti-Semitic slogans and all the Nazi paraphernalia in the middle of this, I just couldn't understand how the Jewish community had become part of that story. And so I think it was a shock to the Jewish community. And then as I read, there was a blog post by the president of your synagogue at the time, which we can also share in the chat. And I also had the privilege of going on a retreat in Charlottesville and hearing from you and members of your congregation about what you had gone through that weekend. And it seemed that there was so much more to the story of what the synagogue had actually experienced. People talked about removing the Torahs from the synagogue, like you said, moving the service earlier, also seeing across the street, because Virginia is an open carry state, seeing people across the street carrying semi-automatics and standing, across the street while the service was going on. And I remember I was an officer of my own synagogue at that time. And I remember reading your president's blog post about, he felt compelled to watch them, but he wasn't sure what he was going to do if they had actually turned on the synagogue, and thinking, what would I do in the lobby of my own synagogue if I were in that situation? And it just seems so unfathomable that in 2017 in America, one would be in this situation. So initially, what I really wanted to do was to tell the story of the synagogue. And I felt that story was not sort of getting out there in the mainstream media, that there was so much else going on that it was overshadowed. So that's where I started. But obviously where you start is not necessarily where you end up in many respects. So, I sort of followed your path and ended up focusing on the aftermath. And the aftermath was a story of resilience and a story, as you said, of re-examining your role in the broader Charlottesville community, the role of the community in history. And so one thing that I wanted to ask you was, what were some of the things that you needed to rethink and that we need to rethink kind of in general about the American experience?
So when I say we, I'm thinking of the Jewish community, but I'm also thinking a lot about our clergy collective and maybe a lot of people in Charlottesville for whom this was also a wake-up call. Quite frankly, for a person who, I was not born in the South, I came down here later in my life, and these monuments were sort of just part of the background, just like they were just there. I mean, to be honest, that Lee Park, which is a block away from us, used to be called Lee Park. I mean, when we have we used to have our gay pride festival, and we'd have it right there in Lee Park. And so, Traveler had like a pride flag, over him and looked a little different. And maybe he was wearing a sort of a different hat, but we didn't really see it's almost like those monuments were invisible, right? But the truth was that we never really asked, and when we started to ask, we never asked why are these still here or what's the history of these monuments, even though they were right in front of us the whole time. And when we asked, right, we got an answer. And we started to learn, for example, how those monuments came up. We started to learn that that 5 parks were given to the city of Charlottesville in 1921, and 4 of them were for whites only, and only 1 of them was for African Americans. And they were dedicated by people with, the lost cause narrative, and the Ku Klux Klan it's all in the pictures. You could have found that out just by doing a little Google search, but we didn't ask. And we found out that for our African American colleagues, they told us some very deep and disturbing stories about the very landscape that we walk on every day, that we take our kids to the park. We walk past that park from our preschool. We sometimes play in that park. We met people who were African Americans who had never been in that park because their experience had been that they knew, even though this is generations ago, that was a place where they were not welcome. And more stories like that kind of came to life by opening up the conversation. I have a colleague who had never been at the University of Virginia because in the age that she grew up, African Americans were not they went so far on the street, but they did not go further. So to hear about a community's sort of trauma in the same space that we were living was really a wake-up call, and really, I think, jolted us all into exploring more issues about our history. You mentioned that pilgrimage in the city of Charlottesville.
Yeah. Tell us about the pilgrimage and the story behind that.
Right. So, there was, it turns out that in 1898, a man named John Henry James was lynched in Charlottesville, right? If you wanted to, you could have found that out. That the Richmond Times-Dispatch reported on it. There were photographs of it. Everybody knew about it, but the site had never been found or marked. So some local historians found the site, and we decided to take as a community a pilgrimage to bring earth from the site of that lynching down to the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery and the Lynching Museum, which had just opened earlier that spring. And what was interesting about the pilgrimage was its composition. So we were about 1/3 African Americans and low-income people from certain neighborhoods in town. We were about 1/4 people from the university, researchers, faculty. We were about 1/4 high school students and teachers from our public high school, clergy, and members of the community, and members of city council. This is a group of people that usually do not spend a lot of time together, but we spent a week together on a bus, going from here down to there, stopping everywhere at Appomattox and at Birmingham and at Greensboro, and to bring that earth from this place. And it was sort of such a cathartic experience to sort of to realize that there was so much of this history that has been covered over, and to hear the discussions that followed on that. I'll give you another example. When Massive Resistance when Virginia resisted integrating the public schools, many white people took their children out of the public schools. Well, where did they go? They went to private schools in churches. And so we as a clergy collective said, wow, wouldn't it be interesting, if we could get our churches to look at our own history and talk about some of these things? We thought, yeah, everyone's going to be interested in that. And you know what? In some places, the clergy were told in no uncertain terms, we do not want to go back and talk about that. So there still is a resistance, right, to sort of looking back honestly at our history. So I would say it created both an appetite for understanding the history of our own town, and also to be engaged in this process of really trying to tell the true story of this community,
Mhm. And do you find people responsive to that in the community, or do you still get pushback against that?
In our community, there was a great desire to really, we were sort of forced into this in a way, this intersection of white supremacy and this neo-Nazi movement really forced us to look at these things. I don't know what you think. I'd like to think that it's not so, but I would like to think that 3 years later, after the shootings in Pittsburgh for certain and Poway, that people understand sort of the intimate connection between this white supremacist movement and anti-Semitism really as the heart of it. I don't know what you think about that, if that's your experience when you talk to people.
I think people are understanding more, certainly. I mean, certainly after the Pittsburgh shooting. I think there was some understanding after Charlottesville, but I think Pittsburgh, and this is just anecdotal, this isn't based on research or numbers or anything, but just my own personal opinion and sense was that Pittsburgh highlighted Charlottesville and that then people drew the connection.
And I think that in that sense, it was a wake-up call for the whole Jewish community, not just ours. I mean, I can't imagine that any Jewish community wouldn't be reflecting pretty hard on that.
Right. Well, and I think now it's broadening into the general community, right? I mean, white supremacy is in the last 6 months is now something that is taking center stage much more, right? I mean, look at this week with an attempt to plot to kidnap the Michigan governor, and also apparently your own governor in Virginia had been discussed as potentially being part of that plot. Protests that we've seen and backlashes over the summer. So I think in general, awareness of white supremacy is becoming much more prevalent, not just in connection with anti-Semitism. So.
Go ahead.
So no, go. After you.
I was going to say that even that term, white supremacy, right? I can remember back when we were trying to find words to talk about this. That was a term that a lot of, I would say, a lot of our members and maybe a lot of people. I think it's a lot of generational. It's a generational, different way of thinking about the problem of race and of racial justice. Different than the way that maybe I was raised in my generation. It's to think about it in structural ways and not just, as I said in the film, what's in your heart.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in that sense, the Jewish community is having an interesting conversation here. And I'd like to tell the story of my own father. My father was born in Poland in 1924, and he was the only person who survived the Holocaust in his family, exclusively, except for two cousins. Mother, father, sisters, brothers, grandparents, everybody. And so clearly, I am a victim of white supremacy, of a white supremacist racist ideology. But I also need to be honest and say that when my father came to Cleveland, Ohio after the war, even with his very, very thick Polish accent, Polish Jewish accent, there were some jobs that he got, some neighborhoods he could live in, some bank loans that he was able to get, because he was designated as white by the society that he entered here in America. And so I think that we as a Jewish community need to understand that. And when we talk about white supremacy and white privilege, we need to be able to hold both of these factors in mind. Yes, on the one hand, we are targeted. On the other hand, we are implicated in the structures of white supremacy. And that's a harder conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because it contradicts the narrative that we learn, right? It contradicts the narrative we learn in Hebrew school about thousands of years of persecution, not only the Holocaust, but throughout history, right? Story of Hanukkah, story of Purim.
Even the story of Abraham, Joshua, Heschel, and his tired old feet, I mean, that is definitely part of our history. But, that was 63 years ago, right? So the question is, what do we have since then, right? Like, hello, been doing since then? And it's not to deny that role, very, very important, of the Jewish community in the civil rights movement. But the question we need to be asking is, so where are we today? I think we need to change our story in some ways and think about it in a different way. And it's given us an opportunity also to see our story, again, intersecting with the African-American experience. I think I shared with you one of the most interesting books that I read was called Hitler's American Model, that really documented how the Nuremberg laws that my father was a victim of, and my mother and my whole family was a victim of that ideology. Before they published those Nuremberg laws, those very, very efficient German lawyers studied every single Jim Crow constitution in the American South to see what they could learn about racial supremacy, So that's a different way of thinking about the Holocaust. That's a different intersection of concerns that maybe offers us a different way of even framing and thinking as a Jewish community about the Holocaust and that experience.
Yeah. So I'd like to come forward to the present time also. Can you talk about the work that your congregation and community are doing now? I mean, we've sort of looked back a couple of years, but, now sort of fighting for racial justice.
So I would say that our community is engaged, both as individually, but more as an alliance. I would say that this Charlottesville Clergy Collective has offered us sort of a wider base from which to do the kind of things that we want to do. Some of the things that you saw in those photographs, in the film, we had these conversations towards reconciliation to try to bring huge groups of people, maybe 300 people together, to discuss these as interfaith and interracial communities where we got to know one another and try to speak honestly about these issues. I'm happy to report, that one of the monuments that's not mentioned in your film, a Confederate statue that stood for almost 100 years in front of the courthouse, was recently removed. The Board of Supervisors voted, and by the way, the discussion this time was unanimous, as opposed to maybe 3 years ago when it would have been a contentious issue. But this time there was pretty clear that statue didn't belong there; it just went down. But as you highlighted in the film, we are realizing that these issues of a living wage and housing and zoning and food scarcity and healthcare access, and the university, by the way, has been a very good partner. They have also picked up the ball and tried to examine their role. There's a very, very extensive looking at the role of the university itself in perpetuating white supremacy in town. And many of our members are involved in both ends on that. So it's pretty active in that respect. I wanted to ask you if there was things that you maybe discovered in the course of the film that you couldn't include, or that you wish you could have included, or that you're still kind of chewing on a little bit and kind of understand, was there?
Yeah, there are always things that you want to include that you don't have room for because you're doing a 7-minute film, and people like you and other people in interviews have minutes worth of stories and minutes worth of things that you want to include that you can't. So I think part of it is you want to go deeper into the material, or I would have liked to go deeper into the material. There were some great stories. There was a woman in your congregation who told a story about driving her daughter to a sports event or trying to drive her daughter to a sports event that Saturday morning, and they got stuck at an intersection with a band of neo-Nazis crossing the street, and her daughter was upset and said, "Mommy, what do we do?" And she, I mean, I can relate to this as a mother, like, you're in this situation, you have no idea what to do. And she just said in her interview, she's like, I didn't know what to do, she said. And so she said, just don't make eye contact. And then they ended up, I think, having to turn back because of the traffic. But just, stories of people's personal experiences. I would have liked to go more into the previous rallies that summer. There was one in July, there was one in May. Interestingly, those were the ones that had the best visuals, because those were the ones where the Klan was out in full regalia. But for the August one, and this was part of the plan, they specifically wore khakis and white shirts to look like the boy next door, to blend in. And that was deliberate. So there were more details and more of the story. And as I said before, I would have liked to include more about what the synagogue and the threats the synagogue received in the story.
So
But
you mentioned that mother and her child. I mean, we were in a position of having to say first of all, to explain to all our kids and our students and our families, what do you say to a child who asks you, "Mommy, why are they carrying a swastika? Mommy, why do they hate us?" I mean, this was a conversation that we hadn't had before. As you said, we teach about it in terms of our history in the past, but these kids saw it, and then, our high schoolers talked about it in school. And, what do you answer a person like that? How do you begin to have a conversation like that? And of course, in the next breath, I'm going to say, well, this is the conversation that every African-American parent has with their child.
Mhm.
At some point, they have to answer that question. We found out that we had to answer that question. So it created, a sense of solidarity or understanding that maybe we hadn't had before.
Mhm. So I wanted to ask you about healing, because, I mean, obviously, so much of what we've talked about has been about trying to heal the community, both within the Jewish community and the greater Charlottesville community. I mean, the whole country now is at a moment that requires so much healing, from COVID and human loss, from the inequities that COVID has exacerbated, from racism and protests and political divisions and distrust of each other. As a rabbi and as someone who has been through a community's trauma, can you tell us, where does healing a community or a country begin?
Yeah, I think the word healing is a little premature. I think as long as the, any person who's been traumatized, really, as long as the thread is still there and active, you can't quite heal from it. What I would say is that, maybe you don't move on from it, but you move with it, and the kind of healing that can be done. There was another side to this story. For all that we felt threatened, by those shouts in the street, we felt very, very embraced and welcomed by the rest of the community that showed up, to protect us and to defend us, and that, constantly would alert us when they saw anything that was unusual. And they themselves would come, a lot of the activists in town, when these supremacists would come back to town, because they would pop up, and suddenly they would actually come and stand in front of the synagogue to protect us. And the way I heard about the Pittsburgh shooting was a Shabbat morning. I'm finishing services myself, and I came down the stairs, and a person had come in with a bouquet of flowers to bring to the synagogue. And I said, "Why you bring me this?" I had not been on the internet. I didn't know. We don't allow cell phones in our service, So I hadn't heard, but it was people in the community who immediately, before I even heard the news, had already come over to offer their solidarity and their support. So that was also a lesson, to learn that we have allies and that we can count on them, unlike maybe my father's generation. That's different. I think you make it, we can no longer deny that that anti-Semitism is definitely real and that it plays a central role in the thinking of people, no matter how crazy we think that, Protocols 2.0 is back out there in circulation. No matter how crazy it seems to us, we can't deny it anymore. So, but we're less trusting. We altered the way that we do business here at the synagogue, and in terms of security and all kinds of things. But also, I think we're more committed to looking at the root causes, and nourished by the fact that this isn't our struggle alone. A lot of people feel this way, and looking to build coalitions. And one way that you heal from something is by getting back your agency, being able to do something, and to make a contribution, and to be able to. That's how you heal, is you feel that, well, something was done to me, but I'm able to get this agency and I can make a change as well. And if I bring more people together and more people together, we're going to be stronger for this. I hope the American people can think that way too.
And do you think, as awareness grows, one thing you say in the film is, with knowledge comes responsibility. So what next? As we greet this growing awareness, what do we do with that knowledge, and what is our responsibility?
Yeah. So I really do think that the question we need to, and again, this came up again after, the summer of the killing of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and and Breonna Taylor, and the conversation, the nationwide conversation sort of put this back on our plate in a stronger way. I think the question today is really that we need to ask as individuals, that is, people in our community who are designated as white, people. We have to ask the question, how are we implicated in this, right? Whether we want to or whether we didn't want to be. How are we implicated by these structures? And that's a more difficult conversation. It really is a conversation that gets at the root of a lot of things that we thought about ourselves. It gets at our self-image. It makes us, ask some uncomfortable questions. But I would hope that the Jewish community can be a leader in that is really in that reflection, and being honest with ourselves, because if we don't, we're not going to be able to help move forward towards solutions. And I think that's the most important thing, is to recognize, just how far we have to go. But it really starts with being able to see some things that we just didn't see before. I guess, the bright side, I don't want to call it the bright side, but the silver lining of what happened to us in Charlottesville was that it really pushed us to open our eyes a little more, and to get more involved and active.
I wonder if there are some audience questions.
Hi. So yes, we absolutely do have some audience questions. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you both. That was an absolutely fascinating conversation to listen to. I want to start with a question that came in fairly early on in the program about the status of the two statues that you were talking about. I think specifically the two that were either side of the synagogue. So Rabbi Goodhertz, can I ask you to elaborate upon that a little bit, please?
Yeah. So both of those statues, especially the Robert E. Lee one, are still held up in court hearings. Even though Virginia, the legislature in Virginia gave local authorities the right to make these decisions, that was not the case before. But in the last General Assembly, it gave localities the right to make these decisions. And that's how that other statue came down, of the Johnny Reb. But this case about the Lee statue is still a court case that was initiated right after the city council attempted to bring it down. And so far, as long as that court case is going, there are issues that are not allowing the city to take down those statues yet.
Thank you for the clarification. Okay, the next question that we've got here, I'm really intrigued to hear the answer to this. So again, to Rabbi Goodhertz, the number of members of your congregation since 2017, have you seen an increase or a decrease in the number of congregants since these events?
We certainly haven't seen a decrease. There were definitely people who, especially in those early days, when they saw what was happening, they wanted to be here with us, whether they joined or became part of our community. So I would say an increase, really. It's not a huge numerical increase, but we didn't lose any members. And, many people who had been kind of on the fence or in town but hadn't formally committed did decide to join us. And I can't think of a single person who left us because they were afraid or because they were uncomfortable. I would say the opposite, really. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. Okay, I've got a question here. So Louise has asked, what about restitution in terms of white privilege? Rabbi Goodhertz, is that something I can direct to you?
Sure. I mean, and Alex, you and I talked about this a little bit in terms of, I don't know if you want to jump in here, but, in a sense, what I mentioned before about how we as a Jewish community, we have a precedent for thinking about issues like reparations, right? I mean, the Jewish community has been through this, as well as the issue of how do we memorialize, right, hateful or unpleasant aspects of our history. We have that from the German experience, So the question of reparations or restitution is not exactly foreign to us. Now, mind you, when it did come up in Israel in the 1960s, it was a very, very contentious issue. And how to do it the right way there's certainly no one right answer. But it's certainly an idea that a Jewish person should be able to get their head around, at least in principle or in theory.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. It's certainly not an idea that's foreign to us. It's just in this context, it's newer to us in this context.
Right. And if you think about the way restitution was done in the 1960s, and again, I'm not an expert, but it wasn't, there was individual compensation and restitution, and there was a communal sort of restoration, a reparations that went not just to individuals who were personally affected, but also to community or representatives of a community that had been and had their rights denied and much worse, right? But a recognition that this was part of they call it gut wiedermachen, making things good again. That's a nice long German word that maybe we could learn, because that's what it's about, making things good again, between communities.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so we through our questions on the Q&A. I'm just gonna, as a reminder, if anyone else has a question that they'd like to submit, please drop that into Q&A. I can also keep an eye on chat, so if that's easier, feel free to pop a question in there. I wonder if, while we give everyone a second, I can ask Alexandra a question.
Sure.
About really, I'm intrigued to understand more about the filmmaking process for you. Like, you've really got this interesting mix of sort of interview, talking head piece with some of this with footage. So I wondered if you could talk more about that, please.
Sure, absolutely. So the film really starts with history. It's based on an oral history that was done by a history professor at UVA, Phyllis Leffler. And it was a very broad oral history of the Charlottesville Jewish community. It was not specific to August 2017, but it had, it was done largely after that. So everyone had something to say about that. So that was really the base of it. And then I interviewed the rabbis separately on my own and set out to collecting visuals from local media. I wanted it to be as much from the local community, the visuals to be as much from the local community as possible. So the Charlottesville Clergy Collective was indispensable. I know Rabbi Tom has been indispensable to your work in the community. I mean, they were really indispensable to this film because they recorded everything, video, photographs. So a lot, I owe them a huge debt of gratitude. And then local media a lot, individuals, congregants. So like that, I mean, thankfully we have Facebook now and social media, so it's easy to track people down and reach out to them for permission.
Right, absolutely. Thank you. So just one last call if anyone wants to drop a question into the Q&A. Just as a quick reminder, Alexandra and Rabbi Goodhertz mentioned a few links during the program. You'll be able to find those in the chat if you want to follow up on anything there. Some of the, there's some information about the Clergy Collective, along with a blog post that is of interest as well if you're looking to explore more. But I think if that, sorry, please.
Well, I wanted to say, I believe that it's been posted in the chat. I can't exactly see it myself, but you know, there are some links to that Charlottesville Clergy Collective, which also has some pretty great resources at the end for people who are interested in exploring a little bit more about some of these issues. And I would encourage people to take a look at that and maybe think about some of the events that have been done, and I hope could be done and replicated in other communities as well.
I actually have a question for Rabbi Tom, because you and I have been talking about this for a couple of years now. Have you seen a change in people's attitudes, people that you work with, congregants, towards racial justice or towards activism in the last few months since George Floyd and the protests? Has that provided any kind of change that you've noticed?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could say that, you know, where in the past, for example, we had been talking, a lot of it had been focused on, you know, exploring our own roles, some of the things that I spoke about, learning about our community's history, Jewish and also in Charlottesville. So now I think there's a desire to sort of look in a more systemic way about everything that the synagogue does. Our religious school, our preschool, our preaching, our role in the community, the use of our building. So there is an effort to look at it in a more, I would say, systemic, actually, way from the point of view of the synagogue, which, you know, it may not make a lot of changes in what we're doing. It may reveal some places where we need to step up to the plate a little bit more, but more, it will kind of give us that overview that enables us to see how all these things are related and connected. You know, how we teach our children, what we preach about, what kind of activity, what films we show, you know, how we engage with the community. So yeah, I would say that kind of put us back to just take the game up a notch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think with that, I would like to say thank you so much to both of you for joining us this evening. I'd like to say thank you to our audience for joining us on Zoom and Facebook this evening. Those of you that are with us in Zoom, you're going to be directed to a survey as you exit the program this evening. If you could please take just a moment to complete that, it really does help us in our planning process. And we hope to see you again very soon. And just once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Alexandra and Rabbi Goodhertz. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Trillian and Rabbi Tom. It was a pleasure as always.
Yeah.